I'm not the type of person who is easily impressed. Years as a wedding photographer have taught me to maintain my composure, no matter the situation. But what I experienced in York changed my life forever. I never thought a simple work trip would turn into such a horrific nightmare. It all started when I was hired to photograph the wedding of Emma and William. The wedding was to be held in an ancient 18th century church, famous for its beauty and history. It was the kind of place that seemed perfect for capturing unforgettable moments. When I arrived in the city, I felt a strange energy, but I brushed it aside, attributing it to the fatigue of the journey. On the day of the wedding, the church was stunning. The guests were excited and the newlyweds radiated happiness. I began taking photos, capturing every smile, every tear of joy. I was so focused on my work that I almost didn't notice the shadow that appeared in one of the photos. A shadowy figure, indistinct, but undeniably present. I thought it might be a lighting issue or a lens defect. I continued photographing, but that figure kept appearing, always in the distance, always observing. My unease grew with every photo I reviewed on the camera screen. Something was not right. During the reception, I sat in a corner to review the photos more calmly, and there it was again. The shadowy figure seemed to be getting closer, becoming more distinct in each image. My heart started racing. The feeling of being watched was unbearable. I decided it was better not to mention anything to avoid alarming the newlyweds. After all, it could just be my mind playing tricks on me. That's when the light started flickering. I looked around, searching for a logical explanation, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary, except for that feeling of cold that enveloped me, as if the very presence of death was beside me. I decided to go to the bathroom to splash some water on my face and try to calm down. While I was there, I felt a presence behind me. I looked in the mirror and saw the shadowy figure closer than ever. I felt a chill down my spine and was paralyzed with fear. Then, the figure whispered my name. I don't know how I did it, but I ran out of the bathroom, my heart racing. After that, the party continued, but I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my mind. I needed to find out what was going on. It was impossible to ignore what I had seen. That night, I barely slept. And the little I did sleep, I was haunted by terrible nightmares. This was just the introduction to what would become the worst episode of my life. If I had known what was to come, I might have dropped everything and fled York at that moment. But curiosity and the need to understand the unexplainable kept me there. Little did I know that the true nature of the horror was just beginning to reveal itself. After that disturbing night, I returned to the hotel determined to understand what was happening. The first thing I did was connect my camera to the laptop and start reviewing all the photos carefully. I was nervous, but I knew I had to face my fears and look for answers. As I went through the ceremony photos, the shadowy figure appeared in almost all of them. It was as if it was pursuing the newlyweds, always close but never clear enough to identify what or who it was. The sense of discomfort grew with every image I saw. I started sweating, and my heart was pounding. I remember a specific photo that left me particularly unsettled. Emma and William were cutting the cake, smiling, oblivious to their surroundings. And there, in the background, almost imperceptible, was the figure. More distinct than before, as if it was feeding on the happiness of others. I decided to enlarge the image to see it better. The figure seemed like a shadow of human form, but without a face. Just a deep darkness that seemed to be looking straight at me through the screen. My mind searched for a logical explanation. Maybe it was just a play of light and shadow, something I could fix with a little bit of editing. But as I continued to analyze the photos, the feeling that something was deeply wrong never left me. During the party, I sat in a corner watching people dance and have fun. I needed a moment to think. I looked at the newlyweds, so happy, and wondered if I should tell them about the figure in the photos. But what kind of photographer ruins the happiest day of someone's life with ghost stories? I decided to remain silent, at least for now. As the night progressed, I began to feel more uneasy. That presence seemed to be getting closer, not only in the photos, but around me. That's when I decided to go to the bathroom again. I needed a moment to clear my mind. While washing my face, I felt that presence again. It was as if someone was watching me closely. I raised my head and looked in the mirror, but this time I saw nothing. The feeling was so intense that I could almost swear there was someone behind me. I quickly left the bathroom, trying to appear calm, but my inner turmoil was in chaos. This was the first night I realized that what was happening was not just a coincidence or a trick of the light. There was something more. Something I needed to understand before it got out of control. The next morning, I woke up tired and restless. The events of the previous night were still fresh in my mind. I decided I needed to understand what was happening before moving forward. I resolved to review the photos again, but this time with more attention to detail. As I analyzed each image, I began to notice a pattern. The shadowy figure seemed to be getting closer to Emma and William during moments of greater happiness. It was as if the entity was attracted to their joy. With every photo I looked at, the presence became more evident and more disturbing. It was not just a shadow, it was something much more sinister. During the reception, I decided to distract myself and focus on my work. But that feeling of being watched did not go away. The lights in the hall began to flicker, and an intense cold took over the environment. I felt a presence around me, as if someone was right behind me. I looked quickly, but I saw nothing. I tried to ignore it and keep working, but the feeling was unbearable. I decided to leave the hall for a few minutes to catch my breath. I went to the bathroom to wash my face, trying to calm down. I looked in the mirror, and suddenly the shadowy figure was there, reflected behind me. The shock was so great that I almost fainted. The entity was closer than ever, its presence suffocating. It whispered my name, and I felt a chill down my spine. Terror took over me, and for a moment I couldn't move. The voice was cold and desperate, as if it came from the depths of hell. "Daniel," it repeated, louder and louder. Finally, I gathered the strength to run out of the bathroom. My heart was racing, and the feeling of panic was overwhelming. I returned to the hall, trying to act normally, but the experience had shaken me. I looked around, hoping to see the figure again, but everything seemed normal. No one else seemed to notice what was happening. I decided not to tell anyone about what I had seen. How could I explain something so surreal without sounding crazy? That night, I returned to the hotel, but I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. The image of that shadowy figure in the mirror was etched in my mind. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, closer and more threatening. I tried to convince myself that it was all just my imagination, but deep down I knew it was real. The nightmare started as soon as I managed to fall asleep. I dreamed of the entity, but this time it was not just observing. In my dreams, it was active, causing horrific tragedies and deaths. I woke up sweating, my heart racing. I knew I had to find out what was happening before it was too late. That night, I barely slept. The few moments of sleep were disturbed by terrifying nightmares. In my dreams, the shadowy figure was always present, always watching. But now it seemed more active, causing tragedies and deaths in horrible ways. I woke up sweating, my heart beating fast. I knew something was very wrong, and I needed to find out what it was before it was too late. When dawn finally broke, I decided I could no longer ignore what was happening. I took the photos again and started studying them more closely. The shadowy figure was in all the images, always close to the newlyweds. With each photo I looked at, I felt the entity was getting closer to me. Around noon, I decided to go to the church again. I needed to understand the origin of that figure. I arrived at the site and began to explore. The church was deserted, which only increased the sense of discomfort. Every step I took, the cold increased, and the feeling of being watched was unbearable. At the back of the church, I found a small room filled with ancient books and documents. I began to leaf through the records looking for any clues that could explain what was happening. That's when I discovered the macabre history of the church. Several weddings that took place there ended in tragedy. Unexplained deaths, horrific accidents, all involving the same shadowy figure I had captured in my photos. The records spoke of a jilted bride who was murdered on her wedding day many years ago. Her vengeful spirit had haunted the church ever since, vowing to destroy the happiness of every couple who married there. Each photo I saw, each account I read, made my blood run cold. I was dealing with something far beyond my understanding. I returned to the hotel, trying to process what I had discovered. My mind was in turmoil, full of horrific images and terrifying thoughts. I decided to seek help. Maybe someone in the city knew more about the legend of the jilted bride. I went to a small local library and spoke with a historian named Peter, who seemed to know the church's history well. Peter confirmed my worst fears. The figure I had captured in the photos was the vengeful spirit of the jilted bride. He showed me old photos of the church, and to my horror, the same shadowy figure appeared in each one, always close to the happy couples. It was as if the entity was doomed to forever destroy the happiness of others. When I returned to the hotel, I noticed unexplained marks on my body, scratches and bruises that weren't there before. The entity was not just observing me, it was beginning to interact with me in frightening ways. My sanity was starting to crumble, and I knew I had to find a way to put an end to this before it was too late. As the days passed, the situation only worsened. The shadowy figure not only appeared in my photos and dreams, but now seemed to follow me wherever I went. Its presence became increasingly suffocating, and I felt like I was losing control of my own life. I decided that I needed to investigate further. I returned to the church and spent hours scouring the ancient archives. I discovered accounts of other people who had been haunted by the entity. Many had gone mad or mysteriously disappeared. The pattern was always the same. A shadowy figure appeared in the photos, and then the tragedies began. I spoke again with Peter, the local historian. He seemed to be my only hope of understanding the entity and finding a way to get rid of it. Peter told me more about the legend of the jilted bride. According to him, the bride named Clara was brutally murdered by her own fiancé on their wedding day. Since then, her vengeful spirit had haunted the church, destroying the happiness of all who married there. Peter showed me even older photos of the church, and there was the shadowy figure, always present in moments of joy. It was as if Clara was trapped between the world of the living and the dead, unable to find peace. With each new wedding, her anger and pain intensified, making her presence more powerful and frightening. My mind was in turmoil. I needed to find a way to break this curse. Peter mentioned that some believed an ancient ritual could help calm Clara's spirit, but he warned that no one had ever succeeded in performing it. The risk was massive, and failure could mean my death or something worse. I returned to the hotel with more questions than answers. The marks on my body were multiplying, and the exhaustion was starting to take its toll. But I couldn't give up. I needed to try the ritual, even if it meant facing the entity head-on. I spent the night studying the details of the ritual, trying to prepare myself for what was to come. The next day, I decided to return to the church one last time. I brought with me all the items necessary for the ritual, determined to end Clara's curse. When I arrived, the church was strangely silent, which only increased the sense of fear and anxiety. I entered and began to prepare the site, following the instructions Peter had given me. The tension was palpable. Every sound, every shadow seemed alive, watching my movements. I knew I was risking everything, but I saw no other way out. The ritual was my only hope of freeing Clara and freeing myself from this haunting that was consuming me. The atmosphere in the church was oppressive as I finished preparing the site for the ritual. The air seemed heavy, and the feeling of being watched was intense. I was determined to finish this, but the fear was always present. Peter arrived shortly after me, bringing with him candles and an ancient book containing the ritual. He was visibly concerned, but he knew we had to try. We began arranging the items according to the instructions. The tension was almost palpable, and the absolute silence of the church only increased the gloomy atmosphere. As we prepared the improvised altar, Peter began to tell me more details about Clara. The story was even more tragic than I had imagined. Clara had been a vibrant young woman, loved by all, but the man she was to marry, full of jealousy and desperation, murdered her on their wedding night. Clara's spirit remained trapped in the church, consumed by hatred and sadness, doomed to destroy the happiness she could never have. Finally, we were ready. The candlelight flickered on the ancient walls of the church, casting shadows that seemed to move on their own. Peter began to chant the words of the ritual in a low, grave tone. The air around us seemed to vibrate with a strange energy, and I felt a cold that seemed to come from within me. Suddenly, the candles went out, and the church plunged into darkness. I heard a whisper, the same one I had heard before, calling my name. Daniel. The voice was full of pain and rage, and my blood ran cold. I felt a presence behind me and slowly turned around. The shadowy figure was there, clearer than ever. Peter continued the ritual, his voice trembling but determined. The entity, now clearly visible, approached. Its eyes were black pools of despair, and the pain that emanated from it was almost palpable. I tried to keep calm, but the fear was overwhelming. The figure raised its hand, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest, as if an invisible force was crushing me. The ritual seemed to be working, but the entity resisted. Peter continued chanting the words, and I began to see flashes of images. It was as if I was seeing Clara's life through her eyes. I saw the moment she was betrayed, the pain and hatred growing within her until her soul shattered. Clara's presence became even stronger, and the pain in my chest increased. She was trying to communicate something, but the rage consumed her. The ritual was at its peak, and I knew the decisive moment had arrived. I looked at Clara, trying to convey compassion and understanding, but the darkness in her eyes seemed impenetrable. Suddenly, a wave of energy swept through the place, and the candles reignited. Clara let out a scream that echoed through the walls of the church, and then her presence disappeared. Peter fell to his knees, exhausted, and I was gasping for breath, still feeling the pain in my chest. We knew this was not an end, but a pause. The entity had not been destroyed, only temporarily pushed away. Clara's spirit was still trapped in that place, and true peace was still out of reach. After that night in the church, nothing seemed the same. Peter and I knew we had not managed to free the church from Clara's vengeful spirit. The entity had only been temporarily pushed away, and the feeling that it was still present, waiting for the right moment to return, was suffocating. When I returned to the hotel, I tried to rest, but my sleep was disturbed by constant nightmares. The image of Clara, with her eyes full of despair and rage, was etched in my mind. I woke up several times during the night, sweating and feeling that shadowy presence around me. The next day, I decided to isolate myself. I needed time to think and process everything that had happened. I avoided my friends and family, afraid that the entity could somehow affect them as well. I spent the days locked in my hotel room trying to find a way to break the curse once and for all. But the isolation only increased my sense of paranoia. I felt that Clara was watching me, always lurking. At night, I heard whispers and distant laughter that seemed to come from the walls. The marks on my body continued to appear, as if the entity was trying to torture me slowly. I decided to go out and walk around the city in the hope of clearing my mind. But the feeling of being followed never left me. Every shadow seemed to come to life. Every person on the street appeared to be shrouded in an aura of darkness. York, which had once seemed a welcoming city, now felt like a cursed place. I returned to the church several times trying to find answers, but each visit only increased my despair. Clara's presence was palpable, and it seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. Peter helped me as much as he could, but he too was beginning to feel the effects of the entity's presence. The church, once a place of peace, was now a symbol of terror for both of us. I decided to seek more information about Clara and her history. I went to libraries, spoke with longtime residents, tried to understand more about her life and her death. I discovered disturbing details about how she was betrayed and murdered, and how her spirit had transformed into something so malevolent. The pain and rage she carried were immense, and there seemed to be no end to her suffering. As each day passed, I felt like I was running out of options. The entity was growing stronger, and I was growing weaker. The constant sense of isolation, the never-ending fear, and the increasingly intense attacks were consuming me. I knew I needed to find a solution, and fast, before Clara could completely destroy me. The feeling of being watched and pursued was becoming unbearable. I knew I had to do something radical to try to end this once and for all. I decided that the only solution was to confront the entity directly, using the ritual that Peter and I had tried before, but this time with more preparation and determination. I returned to the church with a new strategy. Peter and I spent hours reviewing the ritual, adjusting details, and trying to better understand what had gone wrong the last time. I was determined to go all the way, even if it meant risking my own life. I knew I couldn't continue living like this, and the only way to stop the entity was to confront it on its own territory. That night, we went back to the church. The atmosphere was even more oppressive than before. The air was freezing, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the echoing of our footsteps on the stone walls. We lit the candles again and began to prepare the ritual with almost military precision. I was nervous, but focused. Peter seemed as determined as I was. We started the ritual, and the intense, cold sensation returned immediately. Peter chanted the ancient words with a firm voice, while I kept my eyes open, waiting for the entity's appearance. The shadowy figure did not take long to appear, emerging from the shadows with an aura of despair and rage that was almost tangible. Clara's presence was overwhelming. I felt the pain and rage emanating from her, and it made it difficult to maintain my concentration. Peter continued with the ritual, and I felt an increasing pressure in my chest, as if an invisible hand was squeezing my heart. The images of Clara being betrayed and murdered flashed through my mind, and I realized I was seeing what she had experienced, feeling her pain. At the most critical moment of the ritual, Clara's figure became more solid, almost physical. She approached me, her black eyes fixed on mine. The environment around us seemed to vibrate with a negative energy, and the air became heavy. Clara raised her hand and touched my face. I felt a biting cold that seemed to reach my bones. I tried to keep calm and hold Clara's hand. I looked into her eyes, trying to convey understanding and compassion. I knew I needed to show her that I understood her suffering and wanted to help. The ritual was at its peak, and Peter shouted the final words with all his might. The air around us seemed to explode in a wave of energy, and Clara's figure let out a scream that echoed through the walls of the church. Suddenly, her presence began to weaken. The candles flickered and almost went out, but Clara's scream became more distant until it disappeared completely. Peter and I were left there, panting and exhausted, but alive. The entity had disappeared, at least for now. We knew this was not a final end. Clara was still trapped in the church, but her power had been weakened. We felt a temporary relief, but we also knew that we would have to continue searching for a way to free her once and for all. After that night, Peter and I knew we couldn't stop. The relief we felt was brief, and the sense of unease soon returned. Clara was still there, and we needed to find a definitive way to free her spirit. We began to search for more information about ancient rituals, talking to experts, and studying obscure texts. Our research led us to a more complex ritual which required deep knowledge and rigorous preparation. We spent days preparing the materials and memorizing every detail. We knew that a mistake could be fatal. Peter and I were determined, but the fear was constant. We were dealing with something far beyond our comprehension. The night to attempt the new ritual arrived. The church was darker than ever. The wind howled outside and the interior was freezing, as if the very presence of death was there. We lit the candles and prepared the altar. Each of us focused on our tasks. The atmosphere was tense, and the feeling of being watched was almost unbearable. We began to chant the words of the ritual, and immediately the temperature dropped even further. Clara's figure appeared, more distinct and threatening than before. Her black eyes were full of pain and rage, and the negative energy around us seemed to vibrate. We knew we were in danger, but we couldn't stop. As the ritual progressed, Clara's figure began to move, circling around us. Peter continued chanting the words, and I focused on keeping calm. The pain in my chest returned, and I began to see flashes of Clara's life again. I saw her betrayal, her death, and the hatred that transformed her into a vengeful entity. Clara's presence became more aggressive. I felt an invisible force pushing me, trying to knock me down. Peter was also struggling to maintain his balance. The environment around us was filled with moving shadows, and the candles trembled, almost going out. Clara's figure seemed to be feeding on our fear, gaining more power. We reached the critical point of the ritual, where we needed to channel all our energy to try to free Clara. I held Peter's hand, and together we chanted the final words with all our might. The environment around us exploded in a wave of energy, and Clara let out a deafening scream. Suddenly, Clara's figure began to fade. The pain in my chest diminished, and the air felt lighter. The shadows around us disappeared, and the church fell silent. We felt a great relief, but we also knew that Clara was not yet completely free. Her spirit was weaker, but still trapped in that place. Peter and I stood there, panting and exhausted, but alive. We knew we had to continue our search to definitively free Clara. The battle was far from over, but we were more determined than ever to find a solution. We knew we couldn't give up because Clara's spirit deserved to find peace. The sense of relief that Peter and I felt after the ritual was fleeting. Clara was still trapped in the church, and we knew we would have to find a definitive solution to free her. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty and fear. Her presence was less intense but still perceptible, like a constant shadow in our lives. One night, while I was at the hotel, I felt Clara's presence again. It was more subtle but undeniable. The lights began to flicker, and the air grew cold. I felt a pressure in my chest and heard a distant whisper. "Daniel." Her voice was full of pain and despair, and I knew she had not found peace. I returned to the church once more, determined to try something different. There was a feeling of urgency, as if time was running out. When I arrived, the church was in complete silence, the air heavy with a profound sadness. I lit a single candle and sat in the middle of the nave, trying to establish a connection with Clara. I closed my eyes and began to speak out loud, expressing my compassion and understanding for her suffering. I tried to make her feel that I was there to help her, not to harm her. The shadows around me seemed to move slowly as if they were listening. Suddenly I felt an intense cold around me, and I opened my eyes. Clara was there, closer than ever. Her appearance was less threatening, but still full of sorrow. I extended my hand to her, trying to convey that I wanted to help. She hesitated for a moment, and then, to my surprise, she took my hand. Her touch was icy, but I felt a deep connection. Clara seemed to be trying to communicate something, and for a brief moment I saw images of her life again. Her happiness before the tragedy, her pain at being betrayed, and the hatred that consumed her. I felt that I was getting close to understanding what needed to be done. But before I could react, Clara's figure began to fade. The shadows around me intensified, and I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I tried to maintain the connection, but it was useless. Her presence disappeared, leaving me alone in the church, breathless and disoriented. I left the church with a sense of failure. Clara was still trapped, and I had not been able to free her. I returned to the hotel, exhausted and mentally drained. That night, I had one last nightmare. I saw Clara, alone in the church, eternally trapped in a cycle of pain and despair. I woke up with a scream, my heart pounding. When I returned to the church for the last time, I found it empty and silent. The marks of Clara's presence were still there, but the environment seemed calmer. I felt that, in some way, she had accepted her situation, even if she was not at peace. I left York with a heavy heart. I knew I had not been able to free Clara, but I hoped that she had somehow felt my compassion and understanding. The experience marked me forever. And even now, years later, I still feel her shadow in my nightmares. Clara remains in the church, waiting for someone who can finally free her from her pain. And I, even from afar, still feel the shadow of the entity I captured in my photos, constantly reminding me of the terror I lived through and the spirit that still haunts that place.